I'm really excited for these folks to share their perspectives with you, and I also want it to be interactive, so we'll save some time at the end for audience questions. So please think of what you want to ask, and we'll get to that towards the end. So I want to set the context a little bit here. According to the World Bank, there's 4 billion people at the base of the economic pyramid. These are people who live on incomes of $3,000 a year in local purchasing power. And so that's 4 billion people. A lot of the development community focuses on the poorest of the poor at the very bottom. That's 1 billion people who earn about $1 a day. But that's 1 billion, and there's 4 billion who comprise this lowest level of the pyramid. And so that's a lot of people who can benefit from not just aid and charity, but also market-driven approaches. And so that's what we want to focus on with this panel today. And so to turn it over to my friends here, maybe we can start by framing the problem, framing the situation a little bit. And so, for those who aren't close to these issues, what are some of the problems that people in this base of the pyramid experience? Why is this type of poverty so pernicious?
I like to say things sometimes that I shouldn't. So right now I'm going to say, well, you've got 3 white people sitting up here and 1 African person. So I think that's probably why we all balked a little bit at the question. It's hard to create an overarching picture that is fully explanatory. There are a lot of factors in that. But I think speaking to the financial situation, I'm consistently surprised in my conversations with Americans particularly how just in our own bubble we are. We know that there's so much fragmentation within the American landscape of payments and savings and just the whole financial landscape. But there are certain things that we take for granted. And a lot of those assumptions, base level assumptions, are not true, especially in emerging markets. So I think access to any type of formal financial services is an assumption that we make. If you have an identity, you can get a bank account. Not always true. If you can get a bank account, you will get a bank account. Not always true. We have to remember that the trust gap goes both ways. So a lot of formal financial institutions have policies that they can't serve certain groups of people. But also those certain groups of people, I'll speak to refugees because that's where I have the most context, don't always trust the financial institutions either. There's a good reason that people say, well, I can't get a bank account. Sometimes it's that they feel that they don't have enough money to get a bank account. Sometimes it's that they don't trust the bank. So it's just one small example to say it's very nuanced, but I think access is big, and then also just people not having money. I think I hear that a lot from customers of ours at Leaf, that I just don't have money. And that means a very different thing in that context than when somebody in the US says, I don't have money. I think that the friends and family networks are very, very strong. It's more communal. The financial landscape is more communal in emerging markets. And that's a huge strength that somehow we've lost in the American context. But it means that things like peer-to-peer payments have to be seamless if your primary method of getting a loan is from your friends and family. And that's not always the case.
So maybe I can add on to that question. We hear a lot about people in this segment of the population as being unbanked. Do you have to be unbanked to be financially marginalized, or is there more to it than that?
I think Jake's about to throw a grenade in here with bank accounts. So and I'm probably taking some of the wind out of Jake's sails, but when you look back at one of the big mistakes of kind of the first wave of financial inclusion, there was this assumption that if you only had a bank account, let me just start by giving you a bank account. And so hundreds of millions of dollars were spent across the emerging markets, millions of bank accounts were created, very few of them had any balance at all in them, very few of them got any use. And so I think shifting the question is important, and really not thinking about banks, because banks to people at the base of that the 4 billion people you're talking about, it's not relevant. Banks in these markets weren't built for them, and the fees just to maintain an account are very high. And then you factor on things like, what's the inflation rate relative to the APY that I'm going to get if I hold money in this bank? Oh, it's worse than the APY, so I'm just hemorrhaging money here anyway. And so trust is a big issue. There's just the economic model generally, but also kind of like Tori was saying, like a lot of this, the financial services have been solved informally through person-to-person kind of networks. And that's really what we should be focusing on. I think generally, how can we simplify and reinforce that existing behavior versus trying to apply our models to these markets where the bank account is not the panacea. It's often very bad.
Yeah, thanks for taking the wind out of my sails, Ben. Never tell the guy before you what you were going to say. No, I'm kidding. Just to add on to that, when I was at the Gates Foundation, I managed probably, I think, was probably the largest portfolio of academic research into the area of impact of financial services on low-income populations, and funded tens of millions at least of dollars of research to understand this from a very rigorous perspective using academic methods. And the basic answer is that there's not a whole lot of positive impact. There is a few, we funded a series of ones looking at sort of the original microcredit models, almost no impact there. And so funded a series looking at sort of more next generation stuff, mobile money, bank accounts, sort of a whole range of products. And when you got into mobile money and the bank accounts, there was a little bit more value to those. I think, especially with mobile money, where, as Ben was saying, it was activating pre-existing informal relationships where just, took what people were already doing and something that was really valuable to them and then just boosted it up, made it that much better. That kind of stuff did show some impact, but wasn't sort of vastly life-changing. And so, but so the just sort of raw give someone an account, give them a loan, et cetera, I think is a mistake to start with that as kind of this purest goal. Where we've seen maybe better results, where I've seen better results is, for example, we're doing some research in Indonesia right now looking at people who make their livelihoods on platforms. And that can be anything from trading, selling informally via Facebook and WhatsApp, selling on a formal marketplace, Tokopedia or something like that, or doing gig work, sort of a whole range of different ways in which people can make money, in a digital platform sort of way. And while in Indonesia, a lot of folks already had bank accounts when they joined some of these platforms, there's a good chunk of them who actually get a bank account in the process of joining. And you can see within our data that, their livelihood, at least self-reported, seems to go up a decent amount. And they also have this bank account, which they use pretty actively because that's how they get paid from what they're doing on the platform. So those kinds of contexts where you actually have an account, but it's built into an actual financial or income opportunity, we think are much more important. And if we can think about things in that broader context rather than just how do we get somebody an account, we think that's much more powerful sort of framework to look at this kind of stuff.
And I'd love to understand, if we focus for a second on the most vulnerable people perhaps, which is refugees that are escaping some kind of a terrible situation, that are moving across borders. Leandre, from your perspective at Leaf, what are some of the financial needs that this population has?
Yeah, some of the financial needs are, let's say, a refugee is moving from one country to another, or from one country to another, and they want to take their assets with them. How do we make sure that the money or the assets in general that is moved with them and safely and sound? To do that, that's why we created our application to make sure that they can store their money into our system, and when they get to the safe place, they can literally just go and get that money off of them and make sure that if it's a new currency, they can exchange it and make sure that their life goes on.
That's a perfect segue to the next topic of conversation here, which is, what are some potential solutions that a market-driven approach can bring to these set of issues? And I'd like to start off, a lot of us here obviously are interested in blockchain-based solutions. What is it about distributed ledger that can help in this situation?
Low transaction fees.
I mean, there's the nice answer, which is transparency, affordability, speed, all of that. But I think there's also a goodwill perspective too, that there's a lot of hype and a lot of money in the blockchain and crypto space right now. And if we can capitalize on that to make an impact, then that's great. Of course, the overarching thing is it has to actually benefit people. You have to be able to come into somebody's context and use it. It has to be a good technical fit. It's not just about it's fast, it's cheap, it's transparent. It has to work in the context first. And if it does, then yes, let's utilize everything that's going on in the space to make an impact here.
Yeah, and I mean, you see the positive side of that. I see the potential downside, right? Because
Oh yeah, absolutely.
the hype and the money worry me a little bit, having seen how there was an initial wave of hype and money around the initial micro credit models, right? When Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Prize back in 2005 or 6 or whenever it was, and there was this vision that wow, instead of like giving money away, you could lend it and get it back, and in the process, you'd be making people better off and actually getting them out of poverty. And actually, neither of those things really turned out to be true. As I said, the research didn't show a real big positive poverty impact, and the models ended up taking pretty much ongoing subsidies forever and not really, sort of achieving scale beyond I mean, there were some limited successes and things. I don't want to sort of poo-poo the whole project. But I worry that that is with the hype and the sort of money flowing into the space, which is like you said, could have can be harnessed in a positive way. But I worry that we sort of have a bunch of all sort of new actors coming into the space who haven't lived the lessons of the previous set of projects in this era or in this area, and we maybe miss some of those lessons and overextend the technology and the so the activity in such a way that you disappoint and you get sort of retraction and all the things that can happen when there's too much money, too much hype in the space. So I definitely am with you. I mean, I think we actually what the folks on this stage are doing is going to be quite valuable. And in particular, I think the main area where I see the most value within, especially Stellar, but blockchain in general, is the cross-border transfer sort of possibilities, because that is one of the truly hardest things to do, especially in Africa, which is sort of my area of where we work. Being able to move money across borders is a huge barrier to sort of trade, to families sharing money across their sort of emergency financial networks and things like that. And so I think that's a particular use case where if we focus a lot on that, there's not a whole lot of bad things going to happen. And we can really build some stuff that's useful both to the broader economy, small businesses, et cetera, but also to individuals and families in the next billion. And I actually think maybe just to end on this point, I think thinking a lot about not just how can we help that individual family or person who might have a need, but actually thinking about small businesses as a business, about broader sectors of the financial economy or the sort of the real economy. Building stuff that helps them will it can be super valuable for the rest of the economy and sort of the broader economic landscape. And I think that's another area where we should think a lot about it.
So we've touched on hype and whether it's good or bad, whether it's an opportunity or a problem. Let's do a quick lightning round. Does the average person in this next billion know what crypto is or not?
In Africa, yes, increasingly so.
No.
No.
I think there's some in Nigeria, but mostly no.
Nuanced answer there.
Do I get to fight back?
Please.
So if you look at like P2P volumes, and this is all P2P, Nigeria is particularly exciting. Ghana, Uganda, Kenya. So I guess I should revise my answer. If it's the average person, no. But when you look at where the activity is and where the growth is, it's really quite explosive in pockets in Africa. And especially when you overlay with, we kind of came back to this core issue of trust. If you're in Nigeria, for example, you have no reason to believe the central bank or the federal government. You're opting to exit the currency system. So it's kind of macro factors like that are really driving an enormous uplift.
So let's talk a little bit about the dynamics of being an entrepreneur and building solutions in the space. Obviously a large part of this population is underserved. And so that then means that there's a big opportunity to address these gaps. But I'm sure all is not so rosy. What are some of the challenges that entrepreneurs in this space run into? I would imagine the list is long. What are the ones that are top of mind?
Well, just, we mentioned Nigeria a second ago, and it's a market, I have two members of my team are there, and it's probably the market where we do the most investing. So it's just a market I happen to know. And just the regulatory landscape has shifted, significantly in the past even just a year or so. And you just, I think the folks in the crypto community there, for better or for worse, are they're feeling sort of like hemmed in, and that, they've been building to what they thought was a particular regulatory landscape. And, now that's shifted. And I think, on some level, yes, they have a point, but it's also they have a little bit themselves to blame. They were sort of clearly building for use cases that allowed people to get around currency controls and did things that were maybe not explicitly illegal within the regulatory framework of the central bank, but the central bank just hadn't caught up, and hadn't written any regulations, but were clearly, quite contrary to the stated objectives of the central bank and to the national government. Now, whether you agree with those objectives or not, if you start to build use cases, that are pretty clearly trying to get around them, you kind of have yourself to blame when they catch up and crack down. So, figuring out how to manage that and keep the public sector engaged without being too engaged, which can happen also, I think that's a big challenge for the sector.
That makes a lot of sense. What about trust? Is trust an issue here? And does crypto help or hurt people's perception of how much, to what degree they can trust their financial services?
They shouldn't have to know that it's crypto. That's the biggest thing. If they, I think it's part of equitable access to give people options, with what to do with their money generally. And if they want to invest that in crypto, then that's great. But there should be solutions out there that don't require the average person understanding blockchain, crypto, or even that's a component of the technical system. So that would be my first thing. And I think in most environments, throwing in the word crypto does not help with the trust issue. I think that many communities, again speaking within the African context, are still relational trust-based. So in the US, we see a product and we are a product trust-based society. If it works, I will use it. If it doesn't work, I'm going to question it. Whereas in building a business in Africa, it's more, well, does someone that I know trust this? Is there a human connection or a personal connection somewhere? If yes, then I'm much more likely to trust the product regardless of my own experience sometimes with the product, even if it doesn't work seamlessly. So I think that trust is still a big issue. And I actually want to flip the question a bit, just getting at some other challenges. I think that investor trust is also a really key component to building businesses in these environments, because the investors are often so disconnected from the market that they're in a position where they have to have even more increased trust in the entrepreneur to relay what that market is like. And that's really tough for investors to get over. They're just now kind of coming around to the financial landscape in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt. But if you're building outside of those hot pockets of activity, then I think we got a whole lot more questions from investors on, do you really know what you're doing? Who is your market segment? Do you understand them? That if we were building in an environment that they had more trust in, we wouldn't be getting asked those questions.
So you're fighting a two-sided battle here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
You've got to win over the trust of the user base, and you have to win over the trust of the investor base and the regulatory base.
Yeah, that's a different question.
And so what are some of the approaches that you've taken in your own businesses to win this trust? People have a right to be naturally skeptical, and then problems happen, and that causes people to be even more skeptical. How do you win people's trust?
If I can ride on the last point a little bit first, we really have to understand, if we're interested in this space at all, we have to look and understand that incumbent financial service providers have generally abused their customers in these markets. There are opaque fees, there are capricious fees. People have been very abused by the banks and the telcos in a lot of ways. And so we're generally dealing with low trust societies here for good reason. People have adapted to how they've been treated. And so, coming to your question, the bar is so much higher. We can't just be talking about the exciting technology. We have to recognize that losing user money is not an option. That's fatal because of the relational trust, because of how quickly that will spread. And so much more caution is required here. This is money people cannot afford to lose.
Yeah. One of the challenging things we had was a learning curve to the technology. So how can a user refugee use our system to make sure that they understand it, making sure that if they want to exchange money, how can they do it? So with that leaf, we also created a new customer experience where we have our team that's supposed to take care of the customer, making sure that if they reach a step, a blocker in the system, we can help them, make sure that they overcome it, and also making sure that all our users can rightfully do a transaction by themselves and all that.
And that's often for people who have never heard of the concept of a username. So, I mean, that's the context that we're talking about. And customer support has to be much more proactive in that step and in that stage, much more human-based. But that's just what has to be done when you're building the ecosystem at the same time that you're building a product and a business around it.
And you have to explain that to investors why you have to invest so much in customer service and how it is completely different than customer service that you'd have in a different context. So I'm going to ask one more question before I turn it over to the audience to ask your questions. And that is, there have been some statements by McKinsey and others that are saying that the window for opportunities in Africa is starting to close. Do you agree or not?
McKinsey needs to spend more time in Africa.
Agreed, especially outside of Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt.
I agree.
I mean, our investment thesis, as I said earlier, is actually, we're kind of minimizing the central role that fintech plays in a lot of the other investors in the space, and really trying to look at, how do we go beyond just the set of simple payment products and financial products into a whole suite of marketplaces and software technologies that digitize what's mostly offline and cash-based economic activity. And so we on some level agree. I hate to find myself agreeing with McKinsey, but here we are.
Can I just ask real quick on that question? All right, so you grew up in an African context. How many of your friends and family networks are entrepreneurs? Doesn't matter if they're just small businesses or big businesses. What percentage?
It's low. It's low, definitely. There is always room to improve in any segment of the market that you're trying to target. Mostly, if we take the context of financial solutions that are there specifically in Rwanda, you find out that we only have mobile money. That's the leading financial services that we have. But there's always room. There are a lot of fees that they charge, and definitely if we could have more solutions to that context, like Leaf, for example, which has a lot of features that or any user that supports, it will definitely be great. So I don't agree with that.
All right. Are there any audience questions that folks would like to ask? Please.
I'm full of crap with this company. But one of the that you talked about in Nigeria, people are opting out of their financial system because they can't trust government or they can't trust the banks. And then a very American solution to that is adopt USDC. And ultimately what we're seeing is stablecoins are essentially an interest-free loan. And ultimately this money is leaving their local economies and being invested somewhere else. So what are the dangers of adopting USDC as a secondary result? Yes, we're trying to have trust, build a trusted system that is trusted, but at the same time, what are the secondary consequences, and how can we solve this?
Yeah. I think I'm understanding you right, which is so like at the individual level, if I'm opting to exit the currency system, that's maybe in my best interest based on bounded rationality, right? But is there a macro effect to that? Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a viewpoint on how to fix that. I'm really focused on the end user need. Fundamentally, long term, yeah, the more of your people leave your country from brain drain, the more that exit your currency system. I mean, it undermines future generations. It undermines the Westphalian state. So I don't know how to solve it because I think the root issue there is fundamentally one of governance. And until those in government do the things that enhance trust, then people will continue to act in their own individual interest, as all of us would. And so, yes, there are macroeconomic effects. I don't know how to mitigate them.
That's why we built Leaf for local stablecoins. So we offer Kenyan shillings, Rwandan francs, Ugandan shillings today, and that would expand the more countries that we get into. And it was primarily driven by the user and the assumption that, especially at a time of crisis, that's not when they should have to either learn a new currency or be stuck holding something that they can't use in day-to-day life. That's part of equity, right? Is you should be able to use the currency that you want to use, whether that's a USDC, dollar equivalent, or local currency. But I think that some of the challenges, the reason that Leaf does not do that for everyone, Leaf is not a broad anchor on the Stellar network only for our customers, is because there are constraints with liquidity. And at the end of the day, somebody is stuck holding local currency, and that might not bother individuals who have a greater appetite for risk, but at an entity level, most companies can't afford to take that on. You also, in using USDC, you can expose yourself to additional regulation, especially if you're registered in the US. But doing it locally also has its own constraints and challenges. So I think it's more about finding the right solution for the user base and what works in that local context. But that's also partially why I'm excited about companies like ClickPesa. If you haven't heard of them, you should go check them out. I think they handle that pretty well.
I just want to say I really appreciate that question because I think it shows a level of humility about what are we building and what's its effect on the world beyond just do people want it. So I don't know that I can add much to what Ben said. I agreed with most of what he said about that. And I know that the central bank and the government in Nigeria, for going back to that example, but I think other countries are similar. They have reasons for the policies that they put in place to restrict currency flows and that kind of thing. They're trying to stabilize their exchange rate and other aspects of the macroeconomy. So, yeah, it's a very important question to ask, and there's probably no, sort of clear answer, but it's really important one to keep in our heads as we build some of this stuff.
And I'll just add one thought, which is that it's important to build on a sustainable and defensible base. I think Jake alluded to this. If what you're doing is flying in the face of what the central bank is trying to accomplish, they will shut you down or they'll make life extremely difficult for you. And so it's not all about dollarization. We're lucky to have many projects on Stellar that are doing local stablecoins, and there's a lot of innovation and a lot of efficiency that you can bring to the market through those types of solutions that don't necessarily rely on USDC.
I wanted to ask about how you see KYC and AML policies affecting Africa, because even in Europe here, I think sometimes we can see that it's getting quite challenging, even being just someone in Europe or in Canada or the US. When you have policies that say, if I do 700 euros worth of transactions, now I'm in this whole KYC level. You think some people's rents are even more than that. So who wants to pay the rent by a digital currency if it means all this extra KYC and AML? So how do you see that affecting this specific region and people's access to be able to do that?
So at Leaf, we had that constraint at first, where most of our users didn't have ID cards. So like refugees, they might have some expired IDs, and we want to enroll them in the system so that they can do basic services. At the time, we tried to find a way to make sure that those people can get enrolled in the system. So that's why we we are currently building a light solution for our services to make sure that they can access the system and make sure they can do low transactions, and make sure that they can send it to other users in the system, their families and friends, without any IDs, without any requirements that are needed.
I think at the root of this, there's a really important distinction for these markets in particular. Like, it is an assumption that an ID exists, and it's often a wrong assumption. And so just the issuance of IDs across Africa is still relatively nascent. There are some markets that have done this quite well, but to have a formal form of ID is an enormous barrier on the one hand. And then you overlay kind of the geopolitical issues, lots of illicit money flows. De-risking did hit Africa as well. And so you saw banks generally putting up walls, demanding more KYC. Of course, if you don't have ID, you can't participate. So I think generally where it's kind of landed today is you do see this tiered KYC approach. And so your base user can send some amount of money before they need to get to that next level.
Do we have time for more?
Just a very small question, the question of representation. Like, in this business, like financializing Africa, maybe with blockchain and crypto technology, who are the people who are programming it? Like, also like in your companies, but also like in any competitors. How much are the ideas of the local people implemented? I think the question is who's making the profit in the end is very, very important in a historical sense.
I have strong thoughts on this because I very much understand the tension of me being a white American going into a context and building that I didn't grow up in. I see myself as being a translator between worlds because I know, whether I like it or not, I do have white privilege and I have all sorts of privilege that comes with just looking like I do. And so for me, it's important to use that as much as I can, as much as it makes me uncomfortable, but to go into those, very high educated, wealthy investor worlds and speak for people who realistically aren't going to get the same access that I do just straight off the bat. But then also, more important than that, much more important than that, is inserting myself so that I can understand as much as possible. So, my approach to Leaf was I'd lived in Africa before. I've been working with African refugees for the last 15 years before starting Leaf, so had a good context for it. But I moved myself and my family to Rwanda and hired an exclusively local staff, because I don't think that we can build for context that we don't understand. And as much as I want to understand, we need representation, including the actual development of the platform by people who know the market. And I think Leandre's an incredibly talented developer, but also brings to the table this deep market expertise and a willingness to share. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's going to work in context. And I think the more of that we have, the better, until people who look like end users are able to go into those circles that historically they haven't been able to access. So it makes me uncomfortable to say, but I think that is the truth of it still.
I could jump in. Just in the last 12 years, I've been focused on African fintech for 12 years, and I've thankfully seen the ecosystem evolve very dramatically. And today there are hundreds of thousands of very talented developers in Africa. These solutions are being built in Africa as they should be. And then it's incumbent on us, then the private sector, to make sure that ownership follows, equity ownership follows through, so that you can start seeing those kind of like PayPal mafias emerge from the local tech ecosystems. For example, in Nigeria, there's a company called Paystack that Stripe acquired, and they now have kind of a small mafia that started their next wave of startups. And so that's what we need to have happen is to see more and more of that equity ownership accruing locally, so that then they are the investors of the next wave. They are the entrepreneurs of the next wave.
And that, as Ben said, is starting to happen. And we have in our firm, we have a network of 15 what we call operator angels, people who are at market-leading tech company in Africa, who are reinvesting in new companies, and we kind basically work with them to kind of join in some of the deals that they're doing. And so it's great to see that many people, who are at African companies starting to reinvest and not just all the money coming from outside, basically.
We have this war in Ukraine, which is a very sad situation. And there are a lot of refugees. They are packing their things head over heels. It's hundreds of thousands of people came to Poland, to Austria, Germany. And they pack their money in sport bags. Many of them middle-class people. They don't have a bank account in Switzerland, for example. So what would you recommend these people? How can they manage this? If they have to leave their country, there are millions worldwide. Do you see any solutions according to blockchain? What would you tell them?
Slava Ukraini, by the way.
I think one of the advantages within the Ukrainian context is that the population is generally digitally and financially literate. So that's a huge strength working in their favor. And I think I heard recently that Ukraine has the highest crypto penetration of anywhere in the world right now. So I do think that crypto can be a solution for those that can access it. I mean, that was the whole reason that I started Leaf, right? Somebody leaving with money in hand, it's dangerous and it's expensive and it's inconvenient and all of this. And so being able to put that onto a digital wallet and then bring that with you across borders is incredibly powerful. I'll say, from the SDF perspective, that's a lot of the reasoning behind partnerships like MoneyGram. So that if you have money in a global digital wallet, it doesn't matter where you go. You can go to a MoneyGram location in Poland and cash out your money as easily as you could anywhere else. And it doesn't require a bank account, and it's easy to use. So I think we're at SDF, we're actively working on things to address that. I know we're not the only ones, but I definitely think that that's a space where blockchain and crypto can be of huge advantage to people who have a phone and understand basic financial principles.
So I'm going to keep taking questions until somebody cuts me off. One more. All right.
Talking about banking and about the banking system, because how I see in Europe, they charge too many fees. And I think what we are talking right now about it, I think the blockchain will change everything because it's more cheaper and more faster. Let's say if you transfer money from London to Singapore, it takes within seconds. And with the system right now, it takes 3 days or 4 days. Or what we're talking about Africa, for example, if you wanted to send, from Austria, because I'm from Austria, to help somebody. What's your opinion about it?
Well, I can add, for example, we're working with aid distribution companies to make it easier and faster to get aid in people's pockets. But a lot of the challenge to getting fees down is not only on the cross-border payment, but also on the on and off ramp, because a lot of value is still in the fiat banking system, and there are some costs in getting it from that into digital assets that I think a lot of us in this room and in this building are trying to lower. And we'll actually be talking about that on a panel tomorrow that I'll be moderating too. So please join us there. Well, thank you everybody so much for sharing your thoughts today. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks, Boris.